Hi friends, welcome to another video lecture for Greek exegesis of Revelation. This lecture is entitled The Opening Verses of Revelation. In this lecture, I want to say a few words of introduction about what I hope to achieve and think about the importance of this lecture. And then we're going to sort of take a deep dive into Revelation 1 through 8, 1 through 9, to see what these short verses tell us about the author, the audience, the writing itself, and about God and Jesus, about the author's perspective of God and Jesus. So to begin, let me just reiterate, or maybe this is the first time that you've heard it, but that very often the openings of writings are important. Think about the different ways that the Gospels began, whether we think about Mark's sort of abrupt beginning, or we think about Luke's beginning, or Matthew's beginning, or John's exalted beginning. Beginnings matter. Beginnings really communicate vital information about the writing that they're found in. We can think about Galatians. The opening of Galatians is so important when we consider how Paul opens others of his letters, and often includes a prayer and a glowing commendation or regard for the communities to whom he's writing. That's not the case with Revelation, and that beginning of Galatians, that beginning of Galatians really sets the tone for the rest of the letter. And so Revelation's opening provides vital information that orients us to the writing itself and to some of its major themes and motifs. I want to begin with the clues about the author of Revelation that the opening verses provide. And so in Revelation 1:1 we read, Kai esemanan to dolo autou Ioane has emarturesen. We learn about this figure named John, who is also identified as a servant of God, God's servant or God's slave, if we want to use less euphemistic language. John is in the line of other slaves or servants of God, including Moses and some of the kings of Israel, and certainly many of the prophets. The identification of John as a slave or a servant communicates important things about his role, but also connects him with important figures in Israel's sacred history. We know that this person is John, presumably a John that was known to the community. And tradition has long held that this is the same John who wrote the Gospel of John, and who is attributed as the author of the letters of John. The New Testament, in other words, has a tradition of maintaining this Johannine literature, the literature of John. In actuality, it is more complex. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John do not name the author. 2nd and 3rd John refer to the elder as the author, but do not name that elder John. The Gospel of John, the only thing that it says about its author is that the author was the one whom Jesus loved. Doesn't name him John, doesn't give him a proper name, just this description, the one who Jesus loved. So of those traditions, the Gospel of John and the letters of John and Revelation is the only one who mentions John. Attributing this to one of the apostles of Jesus is even more difficult, because the ending of of Revelation seems to describe the 12 apostles of Jesus, but does not include John, the author, as one of them. So it's very likely that this is a John who again was known to the community, but is not the John associated with the Gospel of John or the letters of John. And while there are some points of connection in the Greek writing of John or the letters of John and Revelation, the similarities are not so close that we would assume shared authorship. The next thing that I want to pay attention to in this verse, the very opening verse, concerns the verb martureo, which means I witness or I bear witness. This is an important word and theme and motif in the gospel, or in the book of Revelation. There are 19 occurrences of this root, whether the verb form or the noun form or the adjective form. And the important thing to note is that although John is identified first as a witness in 1:1, it really is Jesus who is the ideal and model witness according to Revelation. Jesus is identified as a witness in 1:5, again in 3:14, and then again in 22:10. So whatever we can say about John's witnessing, it is in the line. It is after the model of the witness that Jesus provided in his earthly life especially. And so witness and testimony become really important in Revelation. They become important in sort of authenticating or guaranteeing the message of Revelation, but they also play a role in equipping and confirming the witness of the churches to the exclusive lordship of God and of Jesus, his Son, and the consequences of that witness in the larger Roman world. Then in 1:9, we learn more about John. We learn he identifies himself as an adelphos, as a brother or a sibling of the recipients of Revelation. This, as Brian Blunt points out in his commentary, indicates a non-hierarchical relationship. So although John is writing this to a community of believers, it doesn't rest in any form of hierarchy. Then he identifies himself as a synkoinos, a participant or a partner, as Bedag puts it. And he is a partner in persecution, in kingdom, and in endurance. What this means is John, the author of Revelation, is saying, I share in your experience. I share in your reality. I share in the experience of persecution and hardship, but I also share in the endurance that is required of that suffering. But above all, maybe we would say, I am a partner with you in the kingdom that we are members of. And it's really the membership, it's that middle term kingdom that enables them to endure persecution and to maintain endurance, because they know that they belong together to a distinct kingdom in their community together. So already we can see Revelation 1 through 8 tells us a good bit about the author, but it also tells us a good bit about the audience of Revelation. So we see in 1:3 two audiences denoted by the Greek there in Revelation 1:3. On the one hand, there is the reader, ha anagenoskon, the one who reads, and hoi akuantes, and the ones who hear, the hearers. And so there are these two audiences to Revelation, the readers on the one hand, and the hearers of the reading on the other. And this really illustrates one of the important factors, not just of Revelation, but of early Christianity in general, which is this idea of Christians as textual communities. An idea that even though literacy was low in the ancient world, many communities were textual communities. They had a text played a central role in their communal life, even if each individual couldn't read it by themselves. But these readings would be performed in a communal fashion. They would be read out loud among community members. And these texts, whether read or heard, became central and important. And this is certainly true of early Christianity, as we see here in Revelation, but also in some of Paul's letters. Now in Revelation 1:4, we learn additional things about the audience. We learn of that the Revelation is directed to the 7 churches that are in Asia, or Asia Minor, modern day Turkey. And in 1:11, we have the listing out of these 7 churches: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. Now, there is a question among scholars as to whether or not these 7 cities were the only 7 cities intended with Revelation, or if 7, as it often is used elsewhere in Revelation, is a symbolic number that just means sort of completion, the whole. And therefore, these 7 churches are representative of churches anywhere, maybe in the region of Asia Minor or throughout the Roman world. I think it's worth noting here just a little bit of what Christianity in Asia was like at this time period. We know that Christianity emerged in Asia Minor at a very early time in its history of development. We learn about Christianity in Asia through Galatians and 1 Peter, and also through Acts 13 through 16. Christianity in Asia Minor, as we learn from Galatians and 1 Peter and from Revelation, was not easy. It was difficult. There were significant consequences for associating oneself with the early Christian movement. And this often resulted in some experience of persecution. That is to say that in a world where religion and politics and economics were far more interwoven than maybe they are in our contemporary world, that there were real economic and religious and political consequences for associating and affiliating oneself with early Christianity. And so we see that experience of persecution in this opening, and we'll see it again elsewhere in Revelation. In Revelation 1, 5 through 6, we learn additional important things about the audience, this time in connection with the person of Jesus. The first thing that we learn is that they are objects of God's love, of Jesus' love rather. They have experienced Jesus' love, and as a result, they have experienced release or redemption from their sins through his blood. As Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza points out, this might have originated as a baptismal formula, as something that was spoken over those who were receiving baptism. This idea of being a recipient of Jesus' love and also experiencing redemption from those former sins. But that's not where it ends. In addition, Jesus, it says, is the one who made the community and made the author into a priest, into a kingdom of priests, or a reign of priests, or something. The Greek is actually somewhat difficult here, but this really illustrates their vocation and identity. So it's not just forgiveness of sins, it's that they have then been delegated or equipped or called to belong to a particular kingdom or reign, and to be priests serving God the Father. It's very likely here that the author of Revelation is mimicking and alluding to Exodus 19:6, which talks about Israel as a basileon hieretuma kai ethnos hagion, as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation or a holy people. So the vocation follows from the gracious and redemptive actions of Jesus. Next, we can say that there are some clues about the writing itself. First, 1:1 identifies it as an apocalypsis Jesu Christu. That is, it is an unveiling that derives from, or an unveiling of, Jesus Christ. Apocalypsis is a word that occurs frequently in the Pauline texts, and I've provided a list of some of those appearances. This opening verse tells us as well that this is a singular vision, that although it can be hard to keep track of, it is a single apocalypsis, a single vision that is recorded in the book of Revelation. And then there is this question of the apocalypse of Jesus Christ, and whether or not that is an objective or a subjective genitive. Is Jesus Christ the object of Revelation? Is Jesus the one that's revealed, or is it a revelation that belongs to Jesus? That would be the subjective or subjunctive genitive. Scholars, of course, debate this, but I think Schussler-Fiorenza points out that what is really important is that the authenticity and the authority is grounded in Jesus Christ, not in John, not even in the angel who gives him these words of prophecy, but of Jesus Christ. It originates in Jesus Christ. It's from Jesus Christ. And it also sort of bears witness to the witness of Jesus Christ. 1:3 continues to describe this writing as a writing of prophecy, but also speaks of the words that have been written in it. So that Revelation is identified as prophecy really puts it in line with Israel's prophetic tradition, which more than future telling is forthtelling. It is the word of God for the people of God. It provides a heavenly perspective on earthly events. But then it also says in 1:3 that these things have been written, which I think is important because it means that although there is an ecstatic experience mentioned later in chapter 1, that we don't get a raw or a naked account. We have a written document. We have a writing that happens. And so there is some space between the originating experience and the written text that you and I are able to access. Finally, the opening of Revelation offers some really important clues about God and Jesus and about the author's perspective on the two. The first is in Revelation 1:4 and again in 1:8 and 4:8, Ha-hon kai ha-en kai ha-archomenas, the one who is and who was and who is coming. This seems to be, again, an allusion to the name of God in Exodus 3:4, especially the one found in the Greek translation of Exodus, where God identifies God's self as ego eimi haon. I am who I am, the one who is, or something like that. And for the author of Revelation, this title, this series of titles, really convey God's presence and God's activity, certainly in the present, but also in the past and in the promised future, which we see described in Revelation 21 and 22. So this idea that God is present, God was present in the past, and God will be present in the future is really important for the theology of Revelation. We see a very similar statement in 1:8, but we get some additions to this. God speaks. This is the only place in Revelation, except for in the end, where God speaks for God's self. And God says, I am ta alpha kai ta omega. I am the beginning of the alphabet, and I am the end of the alphabet. As Brian Blunt puts it, God's exclusive existence at the beginning and end of all things is maintained with this phrase. We could say that God is identified as both the originator and the telos, the creator and the end of all existence, of all things. And then the additional thing that 1:8 describes God as is Ha Pantocrator, the Almighty, or the ruler over all of the world. Another important word for Revelation. I've provided a list of other occurrences. Again, if we think about Revelation as a type of apocalyptic and crisis literature, it is really important for the audience to hear that God is Pantocrator, that God is all-powerful, that God is over even the machinations of Caesar or of the devil. The next thing is Jesus, obviously. What does this opening tell us about Jesus? Well, in Revelation 1:5, we learn a good bit about Jesus. It says, first of all, that he is the witness, the faithful one. That's how the UBS and the NA28 put it. But many scholars, many translations will just remove that comma and translate it as the faithful witness. That Jesus was a faithful witness. In addition, Jesus is the firstborn of the dead, or the first one who experiences revelation. He is the firstborn, which means he shares in that ultimate destiny of humanity, but he does so first. And then he is the ruler of the earth. And scholars have suggested that these three titles are parallel to the three titles for God, the one who is, the one who was, and the coming one. And I think, although Schussler Fiorenza does not think that this is the case, that these three titles or these three descriptions also evoke memories in the life of Jesus, his earthly life as a faithful witness, his resurrection, and his ascension or exaltation. I think I like thinking through them in that way, but obviously scholars are not of one mind in that regard. What do all of these things tell us about God and Jesus according to Revelation? One, they emphasize, they reinforce, they introduce God's presence, permanence, power, and promised coming. God is not absent. God is not unfamiliar with their plight. God is with them. God is present, and God will come to do God's final work. The next thing is the importance of Jesus' witness and rule. That Jesus' life on earth, his model life as a prophet and as a witness, becomes a exemplary for the community that receives revelation. But also, the rule is really important because, as we'll see elsewhere in Revelation, Jesus is the one who is God's delegate, God's viceroy for ruling on the earth and judging the earth. And again, the chaos of the earth, the experience that many scholars assume about the audience of Revelation is held up in distinction to that rule of Jesus, which is affirmed. I would say here that God and Jesus are distinguished here in Revelation 1. They seem to be really distinguished, but as we progress, as we'll see in Romans 4 and 5, there begins to be some intermixing. And Jesus comes to share in some important qualities of God, as we'll see in those chapters. Let me conclude with my so what question. So what? What does this matter? Why is this important for our reading and interpreting of Revelation? The first is, well, like I said at the beginning, we can learn just a ton from these first 8 verses. We learn so much if we slow down and think about them. In addition, major themes and major motifs are introduced. Things like prophecy and witnessing and the identity and nature of God and the experience of persecution and the hope of final things. All of these are communicated and sort of introduced in these first 8 verses. And then I think it's important for us to keep in mind sort of the stages of composition, the seeing of this ecstatic vision, the writing of it, and then the reading of it. What those first Christian readers or hearers had access to was the writing and the experience of hearing revelation. What we have access to is the writing and the experience of reading and maybe hearing revelation. And I think that's really important for us to keep in mind as we engage and interpret Revelation. Thank you so much for your patience and your attention to this video lecture. We'll see you for our next one. Thank you.